I wanted to essentially just cover 5 topics here. And the first one, since this is about, the details of resource management on the preserve, the first thing is, of course, what are the natural resources in terms of geology, soils, vegetation, wildlife, wetlands and streams, and so on. And then I want to touch briefly on the human activities on the preserve, particularly in the last couple hundred years, that have had a huge impact on those resources. And then thirdly, describe kind of the resource conditions as they exist today, or as they existed in the year 2000 when Congress purchased the Baca Ranch from the Dunnigan family. And then I'm going to delve into the details of restoration and management of, first of all, forests, and then wetlands, and then basically reintroducing some of the native species that have gone missing over the years. And then finally, we all understand that our climate is changing, it's getting warmer, precipitation patterns are changing. And so what do the management actions we do today, how are they going to fare in the future? So probably most of you associated with PEEC know where the Valles Caldera is, but I know we have people from outside of New Mexico on this call. So this is in the Jemez Mountains, and this is an area just a bit west of Santa Fe and on the just immediately over the ridge from Los Alamos National Lab. The Jemez Mountains are very interesting because they're basically at the intersection of 2 major fault systems. So there is a weak spot in the Earth's crust that magma from the mantle has been pushing up through the crust, forming a field of volcanoes, a nest of volcanoes, for about 14 million years. And so each succeeding eruption tends to blast the landscape that was created before it and creates a totally new landscape along the way. And the Valles Caldera in the center of the Jemez Mountains is basically the legacy of an eruption 1.25 million years ago. There was a caldera forming eruption. It was huge. Created a caldera about 15 miles in diameter. It's its maximum extent. And then a series of probably 15, 16, 17 separate eruptions came up after the resurgent dome was pushed up during the magma chamber refilling. But a whole series of eruptions created these mountains inside the caldera rim. And these things essentially became forested and separated by grassy valles, which is Spanish for treeless grasslands. So this is the landscape in which we're dealing with today. Now, as we start off and want to exactly understand what the resources are, when we first, the public first acquired the preserve back in 2000, everybody was talking about how pristine it was and how gorgeous, and this was the view pretty much from that I had as well, but it was from State Highway 4 driving along. You actually didn't really get into the preserve very far, but then it became public and people could come in and visit it. And as scientists, when we get out on the preserve, we start seeing some of the scars of human activities for basically the last couple of hundred years in particular, but 11,000 years in general. And I have to give a big nod and congratulations to the very first preserve scientist who actually predated me. We overlap quite a bit, but Craig Allen with the USGS, he's just a walking encyclopedia about the Jemez Mountains. And he was the first guy out there in 2000. And I didn't come along till 2003, but he got a lot of things started in understanding what the resources were out here on the preserve. Some of these, of course, were the obvious things like geology. The original map was from 1970. And so we worked with geologists from New Mexico Tech and Los Alamos National Lab to really build the new geology map. It has incredibly more detail in there. Craig also got going a survey from NRCS and the Forest Service to produce a level 2 soils map of the preserve. So that gave us a lot of background information that was associated with plants and soil structure and whatnot. And then he got started a survey for the vegetation, these different plant communities out in the preserve. and that was finally published and completed in 2006. We're actually due for another one here pretty soon, since a bunch of the preserve burned up in the Las Conchas Fire and the Thompson Ridge Fire. But what we know from that evaluation of vegetation is we have a variety of forest types: ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, spruce fir, aspen sprinkled in around it there, as well as huge grasslands of different species assemblages, different water dynamics depending on where they are in the landscape, as well as riparian zones, and then a variety of shrublands, rocky outcrops, and then these wonderful things, the Felsenmeer rock fields that you can see in this photograph, that are essentially bare rocks that have never been vegetated for the last 1.25 million years. And it's because these boulder fields are so deep that any seeds that fall into them get down so far in that they can't reach the light when they germinate. Since I've gotten here, we've been working really hard on developing an all taxa biological inventory. What are the species of fungi, wildlife, lichens, plants, both vertebrates and invertebrates, all the way through here. So we've got a huge number of experts that can identify to species all of these different invertebrates, and we've done very well on the vertebrates and the plants and the fungi. So things are coming along. We have a lot of citizens help us with this. This is a photo of some kids and parents and grandparents from bio blitzes here from past years. So it's really a really good group of people to work with. And so far we found 4 new species previously unknown to science out here on the preserve. Well, if you put this all together, here's a map of Valles Caldera that shows the locations of all of our inventory and monitoring plots. And you can see we've got a lot of places out there that we've kept track of over the years. And so the preserve is a very well-known commodity in the National Park Service. But there's still a lot we don't know. So there's many discoveries yet to be made here. Part of this inventory and monitoring network, of course, deals with some basic networks, if you will. One of them are weather stations. These are RAS stations, remote access weather stations, run out of the Desert Research Institute at Reno, Nevada. And you can access the website and get live weather data. It's actually about an hour old when it goes up to the satellite and gets processed. But you can get weather conditions all across the preserve. Water is a big deal to us in New Mexico. And so we have flumes and gauges across the whole preserve. And you can see these in these yellow hourglasses located on almost all of our first, second, and third order streams. And so we're really tracking the amount of water discharge coming out of the preserve and flowing down into the Jemez River. In addition, we're interested in water quality. So we have 2 networks, one with zones that automatically collect data every 15 minutes out there in the streams, as well as places where we take bulk water samples and run chemistries on them over at the state lab for this. Finally, we partner with the University of New Mexico, Dr. Marcy Litvak and her crew, for running flux towers. And these are towers in the forest, different forest types, that are measuring carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, as well as water fluxes from evapotranspiration out here. And so having these 3 flux towers from the University of New Mexico is a real plus to understanding the ecosystems up here on the Valles Caldera. Now, I mentioned that humans have had a long history here, and I'll just briefly mention a few of the things that have gone on. Of course, we know from obsidian artifacts and various other lithic stone-based artifacts that humans have been here for about 11,000 years. And the main attraction in the old days for this area were the obsidian outcrops that the people would come and quarry to make weapons and tools out here. And this was a high quality obsidian, so it was very popular. My friends over at Los Alamos National Lab would call this weapons grade obsidian. And of course, we just refer to it as the prehistoric WMDs, the weapons of mammoth destruction. But people have used these for a long time, as well as using the Valles Caldera in particular for hunter-gatherer activities and for religious ceremonies. The last couple hundred years, however, after the Spanish settled the area, was bringing in livestock. And in the Valles Caldera, we had up to 100,000 sheep during the latter part of the 1800s. And this would be from snow melt in the spring till snowfall in the autumn. And these large numbers of sheep out here, you can see in this photograph for the streams in the Valle Grande, but pretty much everywhere. These sheep would overgraze the landscape, kill the plants, the grassland plants, and cause erosion. So here is Jaramillo Creek running through the Valle Grande in the mid-1930s. And you can see the banks are all broken down. The width is so wide and it's so shallow that the sun would heat it up and it would basically wipe out most of the fish that would be in here. But today, now that those sheep are gone, this is the same place, re-photographed by Steve Tharnstrom and John Hogan out here with Craig Allen in the works. So you can see here the stream banks have gotten closer together. The stream is narrower but deeper, so the water temperatures stay cooler. And so this is well on the way to recovery in this area here. Another photograph shows the secondary effect of sheep herding on the preserve. This is from the mid-1950s. You can see the gravel road to the right. That's State Route 4 going through the Valle Grande. This is before it was paved, of course. And the two things to really note in this photograph are, number one, the low grass level in here that is so low that fires can't burn anymore. There's just not enough fuel to carry a fire. And as a result of no fires, these young ponderosa pines start growing, and fire would normally kill them off, and you would be left with just a few scattered old growth ponderosa pines. But this thicket of young ponderosa pines are coming up here. And when I went back to re-photograph this exact same place, and I don't know if you can see this with my marker, but this tree right here is the same tall tree in this photo. So these trees are the same. You can see these branches on the left side of the tree are now dead in the current photo. But you can see what the grass should look like. It's very, very tall. It can easily carry grassland fires, but now these trees have grown up in these dense thickets of ponderosa pine. This is another photograph. By the 1960s, the transition had gone from sheep to cattle. And this is a herd of cattle. We actually know a lot about this photograph. So for example, we know the names of the cowboys and the foreman who was working for Frank Bond at the time. We know the names of the horses that they were riding. We know that the horse Comanche and Geronimo are brothers. And we know who the cattle belong to. This is Bruce, Sam, and Don King's cattle out here. This is a roundup in the fall moving down here. But the main thing I wanted to show on this is the same story from that previous pair of photos. As you see the old growth ponderosa pine and the young ponderosa pines coming up in the understory, because fires had not been prevalent here by this time for 70 or 80 years. And so these trees were now getting a foothold in here. This is what the scene looks like today. You'll notice that the big old ponderosa pines are gone. They were logged out in the 1960s and 70s, and this thicket of trees that is coming in and taking its place. So that brings us to the logging history that really got started in the 1930s, but took off in a big time in the 1960s. And these are three aerial photos on the left side here showing Redondito, the small peak that's on the this part of the Redondo Resurgent Dome here. But you can see from this is old growth forest on here in 63, the logging that basically clear cut all of this and the logging roads that were left over, and secondary regrowth of the forest in 2005. This map on the right shows all these little brown or reddish brown lines in here. They look like topographic lines, but really they're roads. We have over 800 miles of roads bulldozed into the side of these mountains in the preserve. So really heavy human impact on this during the 20th century. This left behind two things. One is the stump fields that we see from the old growth forest. And on the left here, we have what are known as dog hair thickets. And these thickets are basically on the order of 500 to 2,000 trees per acre. An old growth forest in New Mexico would normally be 40 to 60 trees per acre. So this is easily 10 times to 20, 30, 40 times the density of trees. And of course, if a fire gets going in this type of forest, it just explodes, gets in the canopy, and we have a huge stand replacement fire. So this is a legacy of human activities on the preserve, is having most of our forests looking like this. And of course, another human activity is building power lines to the houses in the wildland urban interface. And back on June 26, 2011, a wind came along and blew over this aspen tree, which came in and hit this power line and started the Las Conchas Fire. And this was a huge fire that burned for 6 weeks before it was finally contained. And it scorched about 156,000 acres. About 30,000 of that was on the Valles Caldera. And it was just a horrendous fire. We have a lot of stand replacement burns going on here, high severity, and it ended up just scorching a lot of the forest stands up here. This is a helicopter shot showing the phenomenon of spotting, where embers are launched by the wind ahead of the fire front. It starts fires way ahead of the actual front. This makes it extremely dangerous for firefighters to try to fight because they could get surrounded by fire very quickly. The result is we had a lot of stands that looked like this, basically burned, all the trees are killed. There's nothing but an ash layer across the ground. And so our resources in the forest were dramatically altered by this fire. And of course, right after that, you start getting the monsoons coming in, and with no vegetation to hold the water on the landscape, we get these flash floods of just this churning black water laden with ash and soil roaring down the watersheds here. This is the Rio San Antonio in a typical base flow condition. Creeks usually maybe 2 meters wide. And here it is in a post-fire flood from July 29th, where it's about 100 meters wide now. Just huge amounts of material being moved downstream. And the problem with that, of course, is the water quality changes. Here are 2 water samples. One I collected from that flash flood, and the other is normal river water from the San Antonio. And when we do the chemistries on this, you can see that the total suspended solids obviously are going from almost nothing to 11,000 milligrams per liter, and everything else is going up. The interesting thing is that the ammonium level that went up as well. Ammonium comes out of the soils of the preserve and it gets washed in after these fires. Well, the problem is that the ammonia gets so high that it starts killing off fish. And in fact, that first day for those floods, the Rio San Antonio lost about 35,000 brown trout in one afternoon. And you can see it also silts in their gills and whatnot. So big impacts all the way along. As a result of the conditions of the forest that we knew about on the preserve, in 2010, we were working with a whole group of organizations, some of which you see their logos here. And this was for a big program coming out of the USDA Forest Service and a parallel program from the Park Service here that eventually evolved in 2015 to include both the collaborative forest landscape restoration program and land conservation programs with the Park Service. And so all of these organizations were getting together to plan the restoration work and put all these things together to try to restore our watersheds. And again, we were dealing with forests that were dominated by second growth dog hair thickets. We call them dog hair because the trees are, euphemistically speaking, as thick as the hair on the back of a dog. So it's really high density forest. And we wanted to knock that density down, get the fuel loads down to normal, and get these forests back on a successional trajectory to become old growth forests again. Well, because we had the Las Conchas Fire in 2011 and Thompson Ridge in 2013, about 2/3 of the preserve were burned to various levels. And so we were going to concentrate on the remaining areas. So this is mostly in the northwest corner and the southwest corner. And these different colored polygons here show the areas that we're actively thinning. The green is completed, the purple is planned, and the orange is underway even as we speak. Every day we've got crews out there working on this. So putting this plan together, I have to give the nod to the high priestess of NEPA and the woman who developed our environmental impact statement and our strategic restoration plan. This is Marie Rodriguez, who was with the Valles Caldera Trust until she retired in 2015. But she's the one that really put this together, and we've been following her plan ever since because it's just locked in really well. So for forest restoration, we have two things going on. One is we have hand crews going out to thin the forest using chainsaws. And usually then, if the densities of trees are so high, the fuel is so high, we end up piling this to burn it later. If it's less dense, then we can just lop and scatter it around and wait for a broadcast burn to come through. But once these piles are made, then we come in and we can burn these piles, usually in winter when there's a little bit of snowpack on the ground. These photos were from today. We had the Pueblo Parks fire crew up there burning piles that we had done a year ago in the snow on Cerro Seco. So Jake Quintana sent me these photographs literally an hour and a half ago. So they'll be working on this later in the week too. The other option for restoring these forests is to use mechanical equipment, heavy equipment, such as this feller buncher. And the idea there is to not only knock the trees down and open it up for less competition for water and nutrients, but also reduce the fuel loads. And the main thing here is what we want to do is get the wood out and actually use it for something. Because if we don't have to burn it on site and actually use it in our economy, all the better. It makes it cheaper to actually do this in the first place. So they end up piling these up. They get skidded over to decks on landings by the roads, and then trucks come in and haul it off. And in this case, for the Valles Caldera and the surrounding Santa Fe National Forest, a lot of this wood is taken down to Walatoa Timber Industries at Jemez, Pueblo. And there it's manufactured into all kinds of different products. And this actually uses it. Average lifespan of products on this thing, except for pellets, of course, and firewood, but for the lumber and things, is about 50 years. So it's tying up that carbon for another half a century. And so this is a win-win all the way around here. The slash that's left on the ground, we then will masticate it or scatter it enough, and then bring a broadcast fire in to promote the growth of grasses and wildflowers in here. And so we have fire crews that come in, and the drip torches will start lighting up these understory fires that burn through the slash and the grasses, and then we get a big pulse of nutrients that grasses and wildflowers can use to become established. We monitor all of this information of all of these projects so that we can make sure that we're actually achieving the things we had planned for. And in this case, here's a vegetation crew out here after the Las Conchas fire. So we do natural fires, or human-caused fires in this case, as well as our restoration things. And so here's an example of 5 years of data from a site that this is right after the Las Conchas fire. Stand replacement killed all the trees. And 2011, this is what it looked like. 2012, you can see grasses and flowers starting to take in here. 2013, it's getting more and more coverage. 2014, we've essentially transformed this from a forest to a montane meadow grassland. If we look at the data through 2015, these are 5 years along the x-axis, percent cover of the herbaceous vegetation. The red line is the burn area, and the green line here are controls that didn't burn. And you can see in 5 years, it's 100% cover. And then down in Ponderosa Pine, same story. 5 years, we've got complete cover of grasses and wildflowers across the landscape. So now we just need to get trees to start growing back in there. One of the things that we also see coming in here are basically non-native weedy species like thistles and cheatgrass and oxeye daisy and whatnot. So our crews go out and they monitor the locations, and we can have citizen groups join us in pulling these plants out or some of our crews who are trained, we can apply herbicides to spot plants, you know, to individual plants here. In addition to the vegetation work, we're also doing a whole variety of monitoring for vertebrates and invertebrates all the way through. So the big mammals, the small mammals, the birds, fisheries, insects, beneficial and pest insects, the whole 9 yards. So we're really trying to track what the response is to these different management treatments on the ground. And because we want to make sure that the wildlife is still happy in their habitats, if you will. Jimmy Kane from New Mexico State and Sharon Smythe from Texas Tech, they are doing projects to radio track elk and deer, see how their habitat use is. Turns out the elk love these treatments for forest thinning, and the grasses come back in. It's just opening up a delicatessen for them. Mule deer, on the other hand, delay recovery in using those areas for 3 to 4 or 5 years because they mostly feed on shrubs. And so it takes a while for the shrubs to come back and regain their stature there. We're also interested in the predators, the carnivores, so bears and mountain lions. And so we do a lot of studies of radio telemetry on bears. Here's a graduate student giving the wake up shot after the tranquilizer. So she'll inject him and then move away real quickly because in a couple of minutes he'll be wide awake and cruising along again. Mark Payton from our Valles Caldera staff is working on lions, on cougars, capturing them alive and getting radio collars on them and then following them around. You can see the map in the lower right of 4 different mountain lions and where they're working. The bears and the mountain lions, they're still using the restored sites as well as non-restored sites. They move around a lot, but the vegetation changes don't seem to bother them much at all. We've been following small mammals, the squirrels and chipmunks and mice, and track those both for responses for the thinning operations as well as food base for owls and hawks. So what we find is that yes, if you burn off a forest, change it to a grassland like Las Conchas Fire, you start getting voles and meadow mice coming in there instead of the forest species. So just another indicator that yes, these massive fires essentially change forest communities to grassland meadow communities. Our colleagues at Hawks Aloft and a number of volunteer ornithologists out of Los Alamos have been doing breeding bird surveys on the preserve, both with respect to our treatments as well as just long-term studies on this. And then we do a lot of work with monitoring for the endangered Jemez mountain salamander. And this involves mostly looking at their microhabitats, seeing what the effects are of our treatments on those, because this salamander is incredibly difficult to actually find in the wild. People can spend all summer long and only come up with a couple of dozen, and we consider that a bonus year for sure. And then of course, a lot of work with insects and other invertebrates. Invertebrates basically run the world, so it's important to keep track of these sorts of things. So we do flying insects, night insects, ground dwelling insects, soil insects, all kinds of things here going on. So staff over the years have really worked hard to look at these sorts of things. The results are mostly what we find is exactly what we had anticipated. Again, shifting responses of wildlife to the changes that occur as a result of our thinning. And then as recovery comes in with wildflowers and grasses, we get more of a montane meadow grassland community in the understory of these trees. So things are working pretty good on that score. Spend a couple of minutes just going over. We also do a lot of wetland and stream restoration with our colleagues from various groups and contractors. And this is a map that shows our friends group, Los Amigos de Valles Caldera, their project locations over the years, all across the preserve, many different streams, many different valleys that have been impacted by overgrazing and were in need of restoration for the water. And so obviously for getting wetlands back into the mix, we're very interested in doing this because if we can retain water here, at high elevation and cool areas in wetlands, and it drains slowly over the summer down into the Rio Grande, where cities and farmers and ranchers can use the water once it gets downstream. It's better to hold it here than down at somewhere like Elephant Butte Reservoir, where there's a reservoir where New Mexico spreads its water out to dry, as the old saying goes. So evaporation is much less up here at high elevation. It's cooler. And if we can keep wetlands here, it acts like a sponge to keep our water on site. One of the techniques is plug and pond construction. And here's a series of slides of how that is done. Essentially, this is Steve Vrooman from Keystone Restoration Ecology, works with us a lot on these projects. And he basically can put in these little miniature dams, get the water to spread out and create new wetlands. Does that by saving the sod of the sedges and whatnot, put it back in there, and so it works really well. Here's an example of a plug and pond on the upper left before treatment with the incised channel going in, and when he's all done, this is immediately right afterwards. We get a pond up there from summer runoff and snow melt in the winter. So this raises the water table, increases the amount of wetlands next to the stream and around the pond, and creates great habitat for these things. Just to give you one idea, this is State Route 4 in the Valle Grande, one of Steve's projects that was in one grant funded by the Wildlife Conservation Society. There are over 140 locations that he was able to do in 1 year to actually get through this and create restored wetlands on all these different ephemeral channels going down to the East Fork of the Jemez River. So these are massive projects, and we've got a dozen of these across the preserve that have been done so far. We also have worked with Wild Earth Guardians and another contractor and YCC crews to restore willow communities along creek banks. So this is basically trying to get food in there for beavers, as well as changing the habitat to give shading for water quality, reintroduce the riparian birds, New Mexico meadow jumping mouse and other protected species, and hopefully for beavers coming in. And here's an example from Indios Creek, pre-treatment here on the upper left and post-treatment on the lower right for the same area. You can see the two the fir trees, spruce trees, I'm sorry, in the middle of the valley here, and it's been very successful. So a lot of these areas work out very well. So the last thing I wanted to talk about here were kind of the projects we do to help out wildlife. First of all, from the ranching legacy on the preserve, we had about 60 miles of barbed wire fences, and these are really bad for wildlife. Animals get caught in the fences and die. It must be a horrible death. Here's a bear that was radio collared, and that's how Mark managed to find him. But he'd gotten tangled up and died in the fence. Elk die in the fence, unless in the lower left, one of our scientists comes along and cuts the fence to let it go. So there's a real need to get rid of these fences where we're not using them anymore. And so here, for example, was a fence line in 2012 that was going across the Valle Grande. And we had all these different citizen group volunteers to come out and help us take away these fences. There's an elk herd down along the East Fork of the Jemez River right here with calves on one side of the fence and the adults on the other. And they were having a hard time getting through. So this crew is working through here. And the next day when we're all done, this is what it looks like. So this is really a gratifying type of management action that helps to restore the landscape and removes these wildlife hazards. So it's very rewarding in that regard. We also have just a couple of examples of species where we've lost them in some places of the preserve. So when I got here in 2003, we had no Rio Grande chubs or Rio Grande suckers in the entire Rio San Antonio watershed, the whole north half of the preserve. They should be there. We don't know what happened to them or why, but they were gone. So we worked with our collaborating contractor, Aquatic Consultants out of Albuquerque. And these guys came up for a day in the summer of 2008. And we electroshocked a bunch of these fish out of the East Fork put them into these transport aerated water tanks and drove them out to the Rio San Antonio, fished them out of the tanks into nets and buckets. And the crew then took them out into the Rio San Antonio and started releasing them gently into the stream. And we did this at 4 different places, introducing about 400 of each species. And within 5 years, we had breeding populations all up and down the Rio San Antonio. So we've managed to establish these 2 species, which are actually were listed or were proposed for federal protection, but there's not sufficient information at this point in time. In any case, we've got them back on all the streams now in the Valles Caldera where they would normally find suitable habitat. And so a really well done job by these 4 gentlemen from our aquatic consultants collaborators. The other species that we've managed to put back in here is the northern leopard frog. For some reason, this frog disappeared in the 20th century, whether it was chytrid fungus or ranavirus or habitat alterations or the introduction of predatory brown trout that eat the tadpoles. Hard to say, but in any case, we decided we would try to put them back in. And so we started working in 2012 with Bruce Chrisman, who had a permit from Game and Fish to collect eggs of these frogs and some adults near Cochiti on the Rio Grande. So they're the right genetics for the northern leopard frog. And the first place we let them go was the Valle Seco in 2013, and then Redondo Peaks Mirror Pond in 2014. And this was 2013 was during the Thompson Ridge fire, so everybody had to wear PPE while they were out there because we were technically in the fire zone, although the fire was pretty much out by then. So we had them in buckets. The television news from Albuquerque came up. They thought this was a big deal. So they came up to film us releasing this, and we did make the evening news on that. But we ended up hauling all these buckets down to the edge here and gently let them go. We've been monitoring them since then each summer. And finally, by 2017, just a few years later, the frogs, there were too many to count. So as you're walking along the banks, they're jumping in so fast, you can't actually count how many there are. And we know that they're reproducing. We have egg masses in the waters here, and they've been spreading out. So this is where we first let them go in 2013 and 14. And of course, the frogs started showing up in a bunch of different places, all the way down Redondo Creek, spreading out through the whole Valle Seco, through some of those restored wetlands, as well as this last summer, they showed up in the Valle Grande. So they are clearly moving cross-country, following the creeks and getting into new habitat, reclaiming their original habitat. So that's been great getting those guys back in there. So the final question we have is, how is this going to play out with a changing climate? These are the precipitation data from Jemez Springs from 1914 to 2015. It shows a cycle of about every 30 to 50 years of 25 to 30 year wet periods and 25 to 30 year dry periods. We should be coming out of this last drought period anytime now, and we would expect, if this pattern holds up, to see extra wet or at least above average precipitation here in New Mexico for a couple of decades. Then it's going to go back into another drought. So we have to anticipate that in the future. Climate temperatures are still rising. This is coming up at a rate over 100 years of 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That is exactly what the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, predicted 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit per century. But now that is accelerating. But we're basically the poster child for this. We are exactly on what their models said would be happening. The interesting thing, however, is when you look at this month by month, it's actually getting warmer faster in certain months of the year. In this case, in July, the temperature rate of increase is double what it is on an annual basis. So in this graphic, if you bear with me here, on the x-axis, you can see January through December, the different months, and the histograms represent the warming rate in degrees per year of how it's warming. And you can see a lot of months, particularly in the winter, aren't changing. They're not statistically significant. The months that are getting hot faster are March, June, July, and August, with a mean slope of 0.018 per year. What does that mean? Well, these are bad months to be doing this because March is snowmelt. If it gets warmer, it's going to push snowmelt earlier in the spring. June is our fire season. And so if that gets hotter, it's going to expand the fire heat season earlier in the spring. And July and August are the monsoons when the summer growth occurs. If it gets warmer, then it's going to water stress the trees. So in conclusion then, as we're doing this landscape restoration, trying to restore wetlands, getting the forest tree densities down to lower levels of being much like this old growth forest in the history grove, where we have 40 to 60 trees per acre. They're spread out so a fire can't kill them all. And they can also not compete as much for water in the soil during drought periods. So the idea is to get these forests on a trajectory to become something like this in another 200 years. So it's a long time coming, but to cop a line from Lautsai, even the longest journey begins with a single step. So we're taking that first step now, trying to get these systems back to where they should be. And if we're lucky, they will survive the warming climate until the human society realizes what's going on and starts taking measures to stop climate warming and get us back down in a cooling trend. At which point, the younger trees that are alive today that last 200 to 300 years, they'll survive that. They'll come out the other side and we'll still have forests here to enjoy and recreate in. If we're successful on this, we will have fulfilled the Park Service mission, which is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. So that's what we're trying to do. That's our mission. And with any luck at all, and the help of all the different people that have participated with us in this for a while, we should be successful in the coming years. Future generations of land managers will get to deal with what we're started here this last couple of decades, and we just hope that they'll be successful into the future. So thank you very much for participating in this, and I will now turn it back over to Kristen and take any questions and open this up for discussion. Thanks again, I appreciate it.
Awesome, thank you so much, Bob. So we do have quite a few questions, but I wanted to, someone asked very early on about the live weather stations. And so I went ahead and I found the link, and I'll just give it to everybody else in case you're curious, because it's pretty cool.
Sure.
Okay, so let me just scroll up here. We're getting a lot right now. So the first question we have is a reference/research library available at headquarters?
Sort of yes and no. We're actually working on a new program for the Valles Caldera called Research Learning Center, RLC. And there's an RLC network in the Park Service across the country. There's about 18, 19, 20 of them. And we're the newest one. And I'm working on building that website right now, which will have a lot of that information on there, hopefully by early in the new year. And we'll have a bibliography of all the different publications and reports, many of which you'll be able to download off of that. So we're working on that now. But in our headquarters area, there's no library per se that has all this stuff.
Okay. So, okay, so how are the cattle managed?
Right now we have cattle, a small number, about 150 cow-calf pairs per year are grazed in 2 pasture areas in the northeastern part of the preserve, the Rincón de los Soldados and the Valle de los Pozos. And those are two upland areas that do not have perennial streams, which is why we put the cattle in there. Rather, they have stock tanks that are fed by snow melt in the spring and thunderstorms in the summer. And so those cattle are allowed to graze in there. It's a lottery system for who gets to bring their livestock in there. But basically they're running cattle for 4 months out of the year, and we have them shift from one pasture to the next and then bring it back. We'll graze for 5 years and then rest it for 1 year to let the fuels build up. And then the next year we'll burn it to cycle nutrients, open it up for grass rejuvenation and wildflowers and whatnot. And then we'll come in and lightly graze it. So our grazing prescriptions are essentially under the standard of light grazing, less than 40% forage utilization. And the elk are incorporated into that model so that we give the elk the first shot at it, and then whatever's left over goes to the livestock.
Okay, so this is actually related to that. Someone was worried about your stream restoration work with all the cattle. How has that impacted your research?
Yeah, so the last few years, we've had a lot of trespass cattle coming in off of some of the allotments on the Santa Fe National Forest. And the ranchers that own those cattle are now being very helpful in rounding them up and getting them off once they're detected. But we're also using YCC and Rocky Mountain Youth Corps crews to rebuild those fences on the north side of the preserve, so that a lot of those fences have been knocked down by trees falling on them and whatnot. So it's a fairly porous border up there. So we're trying to strengthen those barbed wire fences. When we do that, we make those fences wildlife friendly. That is, we raise the bottom strand of wire, and the top strand of wire is lowered so that animals can get under it or over it more easily. And that top and bottom wire are smooth wire, so they're not barbed wire. So an animal going under it that scrapes the wire on along its back doesn't have barbs. So we make these fences wildlife friendly. They're still good at holding out cattle, but it allows the wildlife to go under or over the fence without injury. So
okay, so I have a question here. This person, James, is working with Craig Martin north of San Antonio River on thistle remover. He commented there was a significant aspen encroachment on the grasslands. Do you have any plans to reduce this encroachment?
I'm not familiar with aspen encroachment. We do have some ponderosa pine encroachment that is occurring in various places. And we have actually knocked those out in some places, like, for example, El Cajete is a volcanic crater from 75,000 years ago. And it's a nice grassy valley, but there are hundreds of small ponderosa pines that come in there. We go out there with the YCC crew and branch loppers, and we cut them off the ground. And now it's scheduled for a burn to actually let fire burn through there and try to keep that out. So yeah, where we do see encroachment of trees, we do try to knock those back. And getting natural fire regimes back in the grasslands and in the forest will help take care of that quite handily once that is achieved.
Okay, so this next question actually applies to that. I think it's about replanting efforts. So do you ever plant grass in the burned areas, or do you just allow it to come back naturally?
It just comes back naturally. We're concerned about if we get commercial seed that invariably, even though they say it's weed free, it's not. There's always weeds in there. And so it imports two things. One, non-native species that don't occur here. But secondly, it also introduces genetics of grasses and whatnot that would not normally be growing in this location. So rather, what we have is we have seed harvesters, one of which is towed by UTV and the other is hand carried, is we can go out and collect our own seed from a section of Valle grassland and then take it back and spread it out on a disturbed site right next to it for that matter. So we're preserving the genetics as well as the native plant species. Now, of course, 10% of our flora is non-native. So, you know, a couple hundred years of introduction to kind of mess with that as well.
Right.
So
Does
yeah,
this-
we try to avoid bringing in outside seed sources.
Okay. Does the same processes for seed harvesting apply to trees? So this question is asking, have you had any luck bringing back trees? Is global warming impacting your success or types of trees?
Yeah, so we have not done any serious tree replanting. Owen Burney with the Mora Tree Lab for New Mexico State University is doing an experiment testing for different genetic strains of ponderosa pine from different places in New Mexico to see which ones do best here in the Valles Caldera. And that may lead us to some experiments of tree planting at different elevations, because as the climate warms up, we would expect species, vegetation as well as wildlife, to move up in elevation and north in latitude. So for us, species should be moving up slope. And so the idea is if we wanted to plant trees, seedlings that would do well in a future climate, we'd want to plant them at slightly higher elevations than where they are today. This is in the vernacular, this is known as assisted, well, I call it assisted dispersal. You're basically helping it get into suitable microclimate envelopes, if you will, of temperature and water. The one rub on that, this is why we want to do experiments before launching into, you know, a full-fledged program, is if you remember my slide about rates of change of temperature at different months, the winter months aren't getting warmer. It's the summer months that are getting hotter. So trees are generally limited by water availability at their lowest elevations and temperature and length of growing season at the highest elevations. So if we try to plant seedlings higher in elevation than where they survive now, and winters aren't changing in temperature, we're just gonna freeze kill them, everything we put up there. So it'd be worth the experiment to at least see if that would possibly work. So yeah, it's a really good question. You know, how would you go about doing this? You could basically construct your own forest community by mixing and matching different species and different microhabitats, south-facing slopes and north-facing slopes and so on. So yeah, great challenge for the next resource scientist up here.
Right, to be determined. So this question is, how do you archive/preserve your history?
For the science part, we try to publish it. If we get it out into the scientific literature, it's there forever, as long as humanity exists. So that's essentially one of the things. We also archive our data sets. And now we're moving a lot of these data sets over to the Park Service system, or at least the US government system. So we go, all our vegetation is going into FII. The water quality data is going into a program called Aquarius that the Park Service uses nationwide. The weather data are going into the RAS system out of Reno. And so all of these different data sets are being archived for future scientists to use. And again, once I get this webpage built, you'll be able to download those data and anybody can use them because they're paid for by taxpayer dollars. So
Nice. We demand to see them.
exactly.
Okay, so I have two questions about leopard frogs, and I'm going to ask them together because I think they're relevant. So the first one is, were leopard frogs released elsewhere in the Jemez Mountains or only in the caldera? And then the second one is, have you seen any deformities in any of the species or any of the individuals?
The first part is I am not aware of any other releases, but since we're starting on the top, I would think they would be very capable of moving downstream. And the second question, have we seen deformities? We have not, but we do see individuals that have rhinovirus and that also have chytrid fungus. So, but enough of them, apparently the populations each year are reproducing well. So the percentage that have those diseases are obviously too small to wipe out the species at this point in time. So hopefully there'll be a little natural selection going on here that these guys will survive. And
fingers crossed. So to go with that, someone asked about something that I'm not actually familiar with. It's the whirling disease in the streams.
Yes.
Have you seen signs of it?
The last time anybody looked was back in 2002, 2003, and it was not detected. We haven't seen the whirling behavior in either the brown trout or the rainbow trout that are on the preserve. So apparently it's not there. We've only looked for it once and did not find it there. So our fishermen are required to not wear waders going into the stream. They're supposed to clean their nets, sterilize their nets, and basically try to be as clean as possible so we don't introduce whirling disease to the watersheds of the Jemez. So, and the fishermen have been very cooperative about that. So we've been very happy with their participation.
Nice. Okay. And then do you manage the elk herds, or is that someone else's, like a contractor's responsibility?
Yeah, so management of the elk herd is under the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. And we work with their biologists and management team to set the number of tags that are issued for Unit 6B, which is the Valles Caldera. And we realize that while we do have cougars that will take some elk, we have coyotes that will take calves. Bears are actually one of the biggest predators on calves. But for adult elk, human hunts are essentially the main control mechanism we have out there. And so we have pretty good hunter success for archery, muzzleloader, and rifle hunts. And so we encourage the hunters we wish them luck, and because we'd like to keep that herd size under control.
Okay. So this person is curious about the education interpretation component. How is the information about all of your research being disseminated into the public?
Yeah, most of several avenues. We tend to send new discoveries and observations and whatnot to our interpretation division, education interpretation, and they will in ranger talks and information to the public, they'll talk about these different things. We also, again, publish things along the way that gets it out to at least the scientific community. And then thirdly, we've been having an annual meeting that we call the all hands meeting. That is all of these 37 organizations, governments, universities, NGOs, tribes, et cetera, that we get together every spring, and we go over everything we've done for restoration in the previous year, go over all the monitoring data just to verify that things are doing what we expect them to do, what our desired conditions are. And then we spend a second day talking about projects for the following year. So we get public input right away on things to do for the coming year. So that usually gets well over 100 people. We usually have it at Santa Fe Community College. The pandemic, of course, has put the kibosh on that, but we would hope to pick that up in 2022.
Oh man, okay.
Continuing on our annual meeting for that. So
okay, awesome. So we have, let's see. How does one go about volunteering with your projects?
Right. So there is a website for Valles Caldera. You can get on there about activities that are going on, and you can sign up for emails, announcements and things. We can also, if you have a particular thing in mind, so for example, fish sampling with electroshockers in the spring and the fall. This is a great thing. We have a lot of volunteers coming out of New Mexico Trout and Trout Unlimited, these organizations that work with us on this. And the Sierra Club is another one that provides volunteers. So they can get in touch with me about volunteer groups, or just basically sign up on the website for volunteer and to keep abreast with kind of news items and things like that. Also, they could go through Los Amigos de Valles Caldera, our friends group, and the people there, they keep in pretty good touch with us in terms of what's going on. And Los Amigos actually puts on some volunteer activities themselves. So there's a good number of groups out here that work with.
Definitely. This question is again about chytrid, because it is of concern. What are the programs to help Jemez salamanders? How do you think the chytrid and ranavirus got into the Jemez? And could salamanders be affected?
Yes, we have biologists studying the Jemez Mountain salamander have had, I think it's 2 individuals that tested positive for chytrid fungus. And it's something of a mystery as to how they got it, because chytrid is usually found in water, and the Jemez Mountain salamanders are completely terrestrial. So they don't really go into water. So it's kind of a mystery as to how they picked it up, but they did. And so possible routes of spread would be contact of individual to individual. There's a possibility that when we are fighting wildfires up here, the helicopters will dip their buckets into some of our lakes and stock ponds to haul water to dump on the fire. That, of course, is dumping water on the ground that may have chytrid fungus in it. So possibly spots of chytrid fungus could get up on the watershed. We try to use water drops to a minimum. There's the alternative on some of these things. If we're really trying to stop a wildfire, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. If you don't use the water, the fire keeps burning and it burns up more forest, which is salamander habitat. And so if you do use the water, you stop the fire, but you've potentially contaminated chytrid fungus onto the soil. So yeah, it's tough. We try to minimize water drops. And ideally, once we get these forests back to where natural fires can just burn through the understory, then we don't have water drops at all. We don't have retardant drops. We just send crews out to watch it, and just let it burn. And we can keep it controlled in particular areas. So that's kind of the long-term thing here. Where the chytrid came from, I have no idea. Chytrid is widespread. Was it brought in by people or livestock or migratory birds in mud on their feet? Who knows? But it's certainly here, and it's undoubtedly here to stay.
Okay. Are there programs to raise the salamanders in captivity?
Our wildlife biologist, Mark Payton, is working on a recovery plan with Fish and Wildlife Service and State Game and Fish and Forest Service and various scientists to actually develop that recovery plan. So that, I'm sure, would be a component that will be considered.
Okay, so I have just a couple more questions. These are both reintroductory questions. So the first one is, how will beaver reintroduction change the ecology of the BC? Yeah, so hopefully in a positive fashion. The beavers used to be up here. We can see their old dams. I am told, this is hearsay, that they were actually shot out of their watersheds back in the 1990s. I can't confirm that. It's just hearsay, but they did disappear. But certainly there's no doubt
that at the time they had cleaned out willows and aspens, probably in concert with livestock that also eat and browse on those plants, along with elk and deer. Basically, the food plants that they would use, the willows and the aspens and cottonwoods, were gone. We had a few individuals of willows around in the preserve, but essentially they were isolated individuals. So first step is to get the food base, the woody vegetation back in the watershed. And then the beavers can come in and settle in again and start rebuilding dams, setting up shop. The typical cycle, however, is you would expect beavers to eat themselves out of house and home, move on to another part, let that area recover, and then they would move back in when there was sufficient vegetation there, woody vegetation. So the idea is we do have a couple of beavers that are trying to hang in there on the preserve along the Rio San Antonio, two that I know of, and but they haven't gotten up into these headwaters yet, which is where we see the dams from before. So we're trying real hard to get the habitat back, and if we need to bring beavers in, we will. But I have a hunch that as soon as the habitat's good for them, they're going to find it and start settling in on their own.
Okay, nice. Okay, so the second to last question is about wolves, and we briefly talked about that right before we got started. Is sort of, will wolves? Is there a plan for wolf reintroduction, or were they ever actually there?
Well, they certainly would have been here, absolutely, all through the Rocky Mountains, and where the actual kind of ecotone between the northern gray wolf and the Mexican wolf was, it probably oscillated from, during ice ages further north, the gray wolf probably got further south, and during interglacial periods, it probably got further north. But we're right kind of in the middle of both of those. So I think that's the correct answer. We have no plans to reintroduce wolves. The main issue with that is that while we have a big elk herd that could support, probably 4 to 5 packs is what the head of the Fish and Wildlife Service told me, 15 years ago. The issue is that these wolves would leave the preserve and they would make trouble for themselves. As he put it, they'd be eating poodles in Santa Fe within 30 days of release. And so this is a political non-starter. But yeah, they would be down in the populated areas outside of the mountains here pretty quick. So unfortunately, they're not terribly compatible. That said, kind of the Park Service policy is if a wolf gets here on its own, they can stay. So it's not like,
nice.
We're going to roust them out. So, but again, this will be, hypothetical at some point in the future. They're not here now. There's no reintroduction plan. And so right now, the coyotes are the top canid predator at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so last question, and it's like a kind of like a feel-good one. What is your favorite thing about the Valles Caldera, and or what makes the Valles significant and special?
Well, for me as a scientist, I find the Valles Caldera is just an outstanding outdoor classroom, laboratory, and experimental site. All of our studies that we do, whether it's for restoration or species reintroductions and whatnot, we always monitor what we're doing. And generally speaking, if we're doing treatments, we have control sites. So and they're replicated. So statistically, we can defend what we find out here. So it's always been the great support we get from management, the great number of scientists that want to work up here. This is, we're currently running about 55 permitted projects for science on the preserve. That's a lot. Wow. We're in the top 4% of the national parks across the country. So it's a great scientific community that wants to work here. We welcome them. We we try to make life easy for them as much as we can. And the knowledge base that these people have been working on has just been spectacular. So, I consider myself incredibly lucky in just getting this job up here. It's kind of intimidating at times, but I feel that I'm the example of, even a blind squirrel gets an acorn every now and then. So I'm definitely really happy and consider myself very lucky to be working with the science group up here.
Nice, very good. Okay, so that's all for the questions. And Bob, I just wanted to thank you again. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It was a beautiful presentation. And for everyone that is still out there, thank you for joining us and tuning in and listening to this awesome presentation. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for sharing your time with us. We do appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, bye everyone.